With this story, the National Treasury announcing the panel tasked with reviewing the list of VAT zero-rated items. The Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene announcing he would appoint an independent panel of experts. Professor Ingrid Woolard is going to chair that 9-member subcommittee. Joins us now from Cape Town. Professor, good afternoon to you. So just in terms of the status of this panel right now, have you started? If so, how much progress have you made, or when do you start?
Well, and as it turns out, we were going to start this afternoon, but I came in to do this interview, so we are going to meet for the first time at 5 o'clock this afternoon and sketch out a work plan for the next 2 months. It's going to, I mean, it's an incredibly tight time frame. The Minister's only given us 2 months, so we've got lots of hard work ahead of us.
I feel partially responsible, Professor, that I'm holding up this very important meeting just because we had booked an interview with you, and I feel terrible about it. Let's talk about the VAT increase itself, if we can. Do you believe that was the only option that government had at the time?
I think it probably was, Jeremy. You know, for the last 2 decades, every year there have been ruminations about the possibility of a VAT increase, and every year I've said absolutely not. It's a last resort. But this year, even in the weeks leading up to the budget, I was pretty confident that that was going to be the only solution that the Treasury could find. It's not an ideal situation at all, but there really was no other way to find the revenue.
In terms of the work then that the panel is going to engage in when you start meeting, is it looking at whether the proper items are zero-rated for poorer South Africans, or is this simply a discussion on whether to expand the existing list?
So it's both. The list of 19 food items has been in place for the last 25 years. It hasn't been updated. It hasn't been reviewed comprehensively in that time. So part of our mandate is to go back and look at that list and see whether those items still make sense. Consumption patterns obviously change over time. But then the other part of our mandate is to look at whether there are other items which perhaps need to be brought onto the list as well.
And Professor, without...
It's a very tricky balance, because on the...
Well, let's talk about the balance in just a moment, but one of the things is, what would conventional wisdom suggest right now? Would you be looking at adding items, and if so, which? And is there a chance then, or could you give us some indication as to what items might fall off that list, given, as you rightly say, consumption patterns have changed over the past 2 decades or so?
Right. So, I mean, I think it's very difficult to take items off once they're on a list like that. The experience around the world is once an item is zero-rated, it's really very difficult to take items off. But what the Minister's indicated is that he'd like us to look perhaps in more detail at the fruit and vegetable items that are on the list, and perhaps think a little bit about whether there are some items there that perhaps are more likely to be consumed by richer households than poorer households. So if you think about, you know, really exotic fruits or unusual vegetables. And so that's one of the things we'll be looking at. And in terms of items that we might think about adding, obviously a public consultation process has yet to start, but already we've received a lot of inputs from civil society organizations suggesting that items like peanut butter, margarine, basic toiletry items need to be looked at, and that's where we'll start.
Your unique difficulty, I would imagine, Professor, is to find that balance between exclusion and addition of items on the one hand, and also making sure that you are living up to the remit that you've been given, and that's to see that more revenue is derived.
Exactly. So that is the very big challenge. This 1% VAT increase is going to bring in another 23 billion in revenue. The current list of zero-rated items costs about 23 billion. So one can see that as soon as one starts to add items, one's eroding that additional increase. One's immediately starting to erode the increase of revenue of 23 billion. So it's going to be difficult. But I think our mandate is to look at whether there are items that do belong on the list. So are there items that are disproportionately consumed by poorer people, and that are not consumed in large quantities by richer households? So yeah, it is going to be tricky, but I think it's important work.
I'm going to chance my arm with this question, knowing that you're not in charge of policy, but do you think this is a one-off, this 1 percentage point increase in VAT? Perhaps once that 23 billion has been optimized, might we see a return then to the original figure?
So, again, I don't think there's a lot of international experience where VAT rates come down. Having said that, if we have strong economic growth, if the public sector, if on the expenditure side things get more under control, then I do think there's possibly room. I know Parliament is very adamant that conversation needs to happen in a year's time, and so I think there is a possibility that the rate could go down again in the future.
8 weeks is not a lot of time, as you rightly say. What's the initial expectation from the Finance Minister? What do you need to put on his desk in 2 months' time?
So some of the research is actually quite straightforward to do. So the work on looking at consumption patterns across the income distribution is reasonably easy to do. We have fantastic data from Stats South Africa that we can analyze for those purposes. So I think that's that first review of whether the 19 items currently on the list serve us well is reasonably straightforward. I think the harder work is in terms of if we do identify other items which perhaps should be on the list or need to be investigated, is going to be thinking about whether or not whether the benefit would actually be passed on to consumers. So what one's seen in the past is sometimes items would come on. For example, paraffin was zero rated a few years ago, and very little of that benefit was passed on to consumers. So doing that kind of analysis of what the real impact will be is much harder. So I think from that part of the work is going to require the most effort.
Professor Ingrid Woolard, I am going to let you go at this point. You have a meeting to make at 5 o'clock, and we don't want to bear any more responsibility for holding up the process. Thank you very much for joining us live in Cape Town.